the leading leaders in the country. Person who needs no introduction, Wendy Kopp, founder and president of Teach for America.
Good morning. There's something very intimidating about speaking on this topic of leadership, actually, for some reason. But I thought I would just share the story of my last, I guess, 15 years in this. And I think, in many ways, it's learning about leadership from our members, actually, that has led me to feel today a greater sense of urgency than I've ever felt around what it is that Teach for America is doing. So I really want to share with you some of what I've learned, really from those of our core members who are really making a difference in their kids' lives, because it's seeing what they're doing versus what other hard-working, committed people who are not having the same level of impact they're doing. That probably has done more to fuel me every day over the last, years than anything else. But to get to that point, I'm going to back up and just quickly put those stories in the context of this whole Teach for America story, which takes me back to when I was a college senior, now 16 years ago. And one day I just basically thought of this idea of Teach for America. Because at the time, this was 1989, and it makes me seem ancient history, no doubt, to the people in this room, but at the time, our generation had this label, the me generation, and supposedly all we wanted to do was go out and work on Wall Street and, manage consulting firms. And as a college senior, I started realizing sort of how crazy this was. Like, the public thought that's all we wanted to do, but if you were a college student, the reality was those were your options. And as a liberal arts major at Princeton, people were banging down our doors, and those were the options, 2-year corporate training programs. And I found myself searching and felt that there were thousands of other graduating seniors out there just searching for something that they weren't necessarily finding in terms of a way to have the kind of responsibility this corporation would give you, but also, an opportunity to make a real kind of social impact. And I've been very focused on this issue in particular of educational inequality that persists between low-income and high-income communities. And one day just thought, why aren't we recruiting people as aggressively to teach in low-income communities who are being recruited at the time for on Wall Street? And it was one of those things where the minute I thought of this idea, I just became completely obsessed by it. And just started imagining that it could be this really powerful force, both in terms of channeling energy and talent and commitment into classrooms in our country's most under-resourced areas, and the kind of impact that could have in kids' lives. And also because I thought, people's first experience out of college was teaching in a low-income community. What would that do for the way people view the world? Because what I had seen from the college seniors who graduated before me was that they really, many of them went into those corporate firms just because they didn't know what they wanted to do, but they could get sucked in and go to business school back into those firms without anything. If that wasn't their first experience out of college. So anyway, I was very carried away in my own head, and of course did what any carried away person would do with this idea, which is write an impassioned letter to the self-proclaimed education president at the time, the former President Bush. And it was one of these 2-page letters with everything into it, and we got a job rejection letter back in the mail. At which point I realized I guess I need to just try to, start this myself. And thanks to the senior thesis requirement, because I sort of had the kind of opportunity to really flesh out this idea, to look at different models on which it would be based, to look at the policy context in which it would operate, and ultimately develop a real plan for making this idea a reality. And the plan that I developed was essentially, to really start on a significant scale right off. for that in order to communicate a sense of urgency and national importance that would enable us to inspire those highly sought after graduating seniors to apply. And to me, the lowest possible number that would sound big enough to communicate that urgency was 500 people. So I developed this whole plan where in the first year, we would inspire thousands of people to apply and would train in place no fewer than 500 folks. And there was a budget in the thesis saying this is going to cost $2.5 million. And so I turned in the thesis, and then the next day just said, I'm going to try to make this happen. And I think back to that first year, and just want to quickly talk about, what happened then and what's happened since then. But I think almost when I look back at that first year, there's something sort of surreal about it. Because, in fact, things pretty much went according to plan. I got a seed grant right after I wrote the thesis by writing to corporate executives who were quoted in a Fortune magazine article as being supportive of education reform. Based on using that seed grant, I went around and met with anyone and everyone who would meet with me in the field of education reform, in the kind of philanthropic world, which of course wasn't very many people. I mean, I just graduated from college. This is a little crazy, but I'd write 100 letters, had a couple meetings. None of those people would think this is interesting. We'd introduce me to 2 other people. So I spent the summer after I graduated just meeting, by the end of the summer, I met a certain number of people. Everywhere I would go, people said the same thing. So this is a great idea.
Like another microphone.
And literally, people did not leave the college anymore to teach in rural communities.
And, consistent with the me generation idea, it's hard to conjure it up, but I mean, I had people in school districts looking at a list of 100 schools and laughing, literally laughing and saying, fine, you get students from Stanford to want to teach in my school district, I'll hire all 500 of them. And people in the corporations were saying the same thing. So I just decided, okay, we'll show these people that the college students want to do it. Found people on 100 campuses through networks of friends and whatnot to create a grassroots recruitment campaign, flyers under doors. 2,500 people responded within 4 months, which was news in the era of the me generation. The New York Times wrote an article, where is this outpouring of idealism coming from the me generation? And sort of the momentum built, and so a year after I graduated, I was looking out on an auditorium full of 489 Teach for America Corps members who were about to embark on their first year. When I reflect on that first year, I think that there were a few things at work that very quickly made this kind of idea almost far beyond me. One was just timing. I mean, this really was an idea of its time. It was one of those things where I would share this idea with people and they'd say, doesn't that already exist? Like, it just seemed like it must exist. The mood was perfect on college campuses. Truly, people were searching for something that wasn't out there. There was a tremendous just shortage of bodies facing school systems. Headlines saying that New York City and Los Angeles were going to have 1,000 teacher vacancies at the beginning of the year. There was a front page article in Fortune magazine saying that corporate America wanted to do something about education reform. So all the enabling factors at that particular juncture made the timing absolutely perfect. So one was timing. Another was just that this really was an idea that just very quickly magnetized so many people. And some ideas are just good ideas, and it was just one of those things. I don't even claim credit, really. It's just like where people would hear that, and with 2,500 people responding to that idea in 4 months, with funders saying, yeah, and I would send out letters, and while I would send 100 letters and maybe 98 would get nowhere, some, like even very senior level executives would pick up the phone and say, this is a great idea. So that's another thing, I think. And then the final thing, and I really think this is probably number one, was just the incredible advantages of youth and inexperience. The fact that I had no idea why this couldn't be done is really why we have Teach for America today. And I can't even tell you all the many times in which in that first year, that was such an unbelievable asset. And it makes me really want to talk with college students because I feel like there's just this incredible advantage to youth and inexperience. And I think your choices right out of college about what you do at that stage really do matter, because I think in many ways that advantage gives you the ability to accomplish things that other people who might be, even I myself now, might be a little more jaded or a little more influenced about the way the real world really is. But I mean, I just remember back to when my thesis advisor read this thesis and called me into his office and said, do you know how hard it is to raise $2,500, let alone $2.5 million, which is what I said the first year was going to cost in this thesis. And I was like, that was just like in one ear, out the other. It's like, I'm sure it can be done. And now if someone came to me, I'd ask them the same question. So I think that those things really came together to enable, there to be so much momentum in the first year. And the story that people tell about Teach for America is often the one that I just told, like how it got off the ground. And yet, from my perspective, I think, without any question, the hard work, the first year was hard, and I don't want to minimize that. It was challenging in so many ways, but the harder work was figuring out how to sustain this. I very quickly learned the advantage of experience as well, and just went through, with my colleagues at Teach for America, massive learning curves. Programmatically, how do we actually do this? How do you recruit and select the right people and train and support them well so that they don't just survive, but actually excel with their kids and leave more committed and not more disillusioned? And at the same time that there were massive programmatic learning curves, there were just massive organizational learning curves in terms of how do you manage something on a significant scale and how do you sustain it financially? So really for a decade after I graduated, we were going through just incredible, ups and downs and near-death experiences as I went through and together with others at Teach for America went through those learning curves. We did finally, by our 10th year, gain a measure of stability. And in fact, by that point, had built a really solid foundation. And there were a couple of probably lessons more fundamental than the rest that I learned in that first decade that enabled us to gain that stability. And they may sound, and no doubt do sound, they would have sounded to me when I graduated from college like the most mundane thing you could possibly say. And that's almost the point. I ultimately realized that a couple of relatively mundane on some level lessons were really the key to Teach for America making it and having the impact that I'd originally envisioned. One of them was just the incredible importance and power of discipline and focus. I don't know if you all are familiar with City Year or have met the founders of City Year here in Boston, but an urban Peace Corps that had started the year before Teach for America. And the first summer after I graduated, one of the people I talked with was Michael Brown, who was one of the co-founders, and he said, one lesson I have to share with you: learn to say no. And at the time, I had no idea really what that meant, but I learned over time, and I finally looked back in about year 6 or so of Teach for America and thought, Michael Brown was right. That's like the fundamental lesson. And just staying the course in a clarity of purpose and mission, and making strategic choices that are all about staying the course in that purpose, because there are just so many ways in which that became the fundamental lesson. And matched with, it's interesting because when I first started out in this, I really had no time for what I viewed as the mundane details of management, and thought that in an endeavor like this, there really shouldn't be any need for any sort of hierarchy or, administration sort of mundane details, because this would be a movement of people who really shared the same convictions and were, all equal in this pursuit of doing whatever it took to get where we were trying to go. And yet I saw Teach for America almost die because of the lack of just basic management systems. And at some point, because I didn't see around me someone with, lots of management experience who was going to take over what at the time seemed like somewhat of a sinking ship, I realized I'm going to have to learn how to become a good manager, meaning, and I went through this learning curve around all the, I don't know if you all have read Jim Collins in this class. Do you all read that or not at all? But just the lessons that you would see if you read that book around, the importance of ensuring talent at every level of the organization, of building a strong culture based on clearly articulated values, of being really clear about priorities and outcomes and having systems for accountability and continuous improvement. I mean, all of that I realized ultimately was the key to Teach for America really being able to even survive, let alone thrive as a force in the kind of broader education reform effort. So those are some of the kind of lessons and reflections, I guess, on our first decade. As we finally gained a measure of stability in our 10th year, we stepped back and asked ourselves essentially how to grow our impact, and really reflected a lot. I did personally, along with others at Teach for America, around what we could do to have a greater impact. And as I think about really what the most important reflections were, that then, I mean, we at that point ended up launching a really, for us, ambitious growth plan that called for Teach for America to grow in scale, to increase the measurable impact of our core members during their 2 years and of our alumni ongoing in their leadership. And when I think about what it was at the core of what led us to determine that we had to do more, it was really the lessons that we learned by looking at what some of our core members were accomplishing with their kids. And this brings us, as close to the topic of leadership as I could possibly come. I want to just share a couple of those stories and then step back from them to talk about what I took from seeing hundreds of people like this. So again, Teach for America has right now 3,500 core members out there. Some of them are literally changing their kids' academic prospects and, in turn, their life prospects, but not all of them. So I want to be clear about the fact that, in fact, my inspiration comes from looking at what the most successful of them, an increasing percentage of our folks, by the way, who have that level of impact, what are they doing that's different from those who are working hard and are committed but are not having that level of impact? And I think the answer ultimately is in leadership. So just a couple of stories. One, again, I could pick any number, but I think about a woman named Aurora Laura, who taught in Houston, Texas. She herself had grown up in a community like that in which Teach for America works, and was motivated to join Teach for America to ensure that other kids had the opportunities that she ended up having as a student at the University of Texas and such. So she finds herself in a fourth grade classroom, and fourth graders are supposed to be able to write like 5-paragraph essays, and at the end of the year they're supposed to be able to pass this test in Texas, which I don't know if you've heard of this test, but it's very notorious at this point, but you've got to be able to pass this test. She tells the story about how in her first and second week of school, she was just devastated to find out where her kids were, because she discovered that they were really, on all of her diagnostic tests that she was using as a teacher at the first grade level, they could not write a complete sentence, literally. And she tells about going home at night and just crying. She's so angry. She's angry at how could this possibly be, at the system and at Teach for America for putting her there. But by about week 3 of the school year, she tells about how she resolved that, she was going to have to change this. And she went back into the classroom and said, by the end of the year, all of us, the kids in this room, all of you are going to pass this fourth grade test. You're going to write beautiful 5-paragraph essays. And she was very clear about that being the big idea. That was the big vision that she set for her class. People thought she was nuts. The other teachers, the principal thought she was crazy. The kids thought she was crazy. But she went about convincing the kids that if they worked harder than they'd ever worked before, that they could get smart and accomplish that goal, and that would matter in their lives. And she convinced the parents as well that it was going to take extraordinary effort on the kids' part and therefore lots of support from the parents, but that it was really going to matter. So she put just tremendous energy into motivating her kids and those who kind of influence and motivate the kids and support the kids into working that hard. And then she was just completely purposeful. So you'd walk into her classroom and you wouldn't see a teacher who'd sort of developed a creative lesson plan and was going through the motions of delivering it, but you would literally see a teacher who's on a mission. You would sense the sense of urgency. Like 2 minutes in, you'd be like, there's something different going on in this room, because there's a person in front of that classroom, walking around the classroom, who's thinking constantly, how do I maximize the time I've got in this moment to move my kids where I need them to be at the end of the year. And then she would encounter these huge obstacles. You know, one of them, the most obvious being she did not have enough time to actually do what she'd set out to do. I mean, her kids were at the first grade level, they're getting to school at 8, they're leaving at 3, and she realized she was never going to get it done. So she convinced the parents to drop their kids off early, pick them up late. She got a key to the school building and started having Saturday school every week. Fast forward, at the end of the year, every one of her kids, even the kid who transferred into her class, a few weeks into the year, and with the teacher who dropped the kid off into her class saying, this kid is too dumb to learn. Even that kid, all of the kids passed the 4th grade test at the end of the year. I want to share one other story at a different grade level, and then just step back from these and talk about what I take from them. Nicole Sharon, teaching 7th and 8th grade math, went to Boston College as a psychology major. She finds herself teaching math to 120 7th and 8th graders. She tells the story of her first few weeks of school as just first day of school, looking out on a sea of disengaged faces. And honestly, to the point where she's just like, what am I going to do? How am I going to penetrate this incredible lack of enthusiasm and just complete boredom with math? So she started spending more time with her kids after school, trying to hang out in their extracurriculars or sports teams, going out to some of their homes. And she said that one day, a couple weeks in, it hit her what the fundamental issue was, because every time she'd introduce herself, she'd say, I'm Miss Sharon, I'm the new math teacher. And the kids would say, oh, I hate math, I can't do it. And she said, literally, it always went together. I hate math, I can't do it. And so she realized the kids just had absolutely no confidence that they could actually do math. So she sort of backed up to where they were and started meeting them where they were and just building their confidence. She showed me actually where her kids were on 3 different assessments that they use in this Phoenix area where she was teaching. And her kids were literally, if you saw the charts, it's almost shocking. Her classes were the lowest performing classes in her district and in all of the surrounding districts, very small districts in this very impoverished community in Phoenix. So her resolution was, I'm going to get my kids to be the top performing math students, in this area. And it sounds almost impossible. I mean, these are middle schoolers. They don't want to be there. But she starts in on her mission. You walk into her classroom, you see this incredible sense of purpose. She realizes, too, that there are massive obstacles between her and reaching that goal. The first and foremost of which, again, is lack of time. But what's she going to do? She's got so many different classes of kids. She can't have them all get there early and all stay late. But she thinks, you know what? There's a school-wide study hall, 45 minutes every day for every kid. I'm going to get, she's 23 years old, the rest of the faculty members to turn that study hall into a math tutorial. So she convinces all the other faculty members to start tutoring kids in math during the study hall. Fast forward to the end of the year, her kids literally, again, I saw the assessment results myself, were the top performing math students, not only in her district, but in the surrounding districts. And 3/4 of her 8th graders signed up for an honors math track in the high school, which was so shocking to the high school counselors that they got in their car and drove over to the middle school to say, what is going on here? We've never seen one student from this school sign up for the honors math track. So stepping back from those and other stories like them, what I see from those is that what those teachers are really doing is really what the most effective leaders in any context would do, right? Set the big vision, motivate others to work harder than they've ever worked before to get there, completely purposeful and goal-oriented about how they use every minute, and strategic about how they work toward the goal, and then absolutely relentless. You encounter obstacles that other people, mere mortals, would say, don't have enough time. There's so many challenges, and I'm really oversimplifying in this conversation all the challenges that they were encountering in moving from one point to where they actually met their vision, but they were just relentless about saying, I'm going to make it happen, whatever it takes. So I step back from that, and of course it fuels my sense of urgency. In so many ways, those stories fuel our sense of urgency at Teach for America, because first of all, you just see the incredible impact that someone even straight out of college with real leadership ability can have in the lives of kids. And you also see, I think, just reflecting more broadly on our experience in the broader kind of education reform movement and education system, you look at what it takes for those teachers to be as successful as they are, and I conclude at least that more teachers going to those extents, because I've never seen anything less than that level of effort achieve the same result. And so it makes me think that more teachers going to that extent, while absolutely critical as long as we have the situation we have in our country, is ultimately not sufficient. And so what's the real answer? The long-term answer that will really get us where we're trying to go, where all kids in our country have the chance to attain an excellent education. And from what I've seen over time, ultimately it's all about leadership. If you go now, and you can go to any number of dozens of schools actually in low-income communities that are doing on a whole school level what those teachers are doing in their classrooms. Whenever you go into those, you find a school leader who is on an absolute mission, who basically at the whole school level is exerting the kind of leadership that those teachers are exerting at the classroom level. When I look at the school systems that are actually making, in my opinion, and this is still, everyone has their opinions, but that are actually moving the needle in terms of student achievement, you see real leaders in those systems who are actually obsessed with leadership at every level. So the idea that, to me, their examples, the Auroras of the world, the Nicoles of the world, show us that if we're ever ultimately truly going to be a country that offers all kids an equal opportunity, we just have no real option but to get our most promising future leaders to engage in this work. Because at the end of the day, it will take long-term sustained leadership in this realm, and those experiences for those core members are transformative, and many of those folks will stay in education and will become. Aurora right now is one of the 5 or 6 doctoral students in the urban superintendent's program at Harvard, actually. And if she continues on her path, she'll be a superintendent by the time she's in her 30s, 30, even less than 35 probably. And that's one thing we need. The other thing that I've seen is just the incredible power of leaders in every sector to shape our country's priorities and our ideology. And, I can go on and on about this stuff, and I'm probably veering from the topic, but just to share, because I think about this stuff every day, and it's sort of what fuels my conviction around this. I was just at, a lunch that Newsweek had hosted to talk about this issue of competitiveness that everyone, is obsessed about right now in our country. And they had brought together, people who would presumably know about competitiveness, to ask them what they really thought about the state of the United States and what we needed to do as a country to be competitive in the world. And the people in the room were like Jack Welch, from GE, and Pete Peterson, this big business leader, the president of MIT, the head of Sloan Kettering, who's sort of known as a brilliant man, other scientists and such. Very quickly, the conversation came down to education, and the Newsweek editor asked, what do you all think is the answer? And people started talking. And the first comment was basically around the concern of a very thoughtful, I think, very well-intended, civic-minded guy, just as he looked at the demographics of our country and reflected on how we're becoming more and more diverse as a country, and yet, in his view, the fundamental issue is that there's not a culture of achievement among the Latino, Hispanic, and African American communities. And as I sat there and listened to this, and literally the Newsweek editor was looking for the next cover story, I was literally just thinking, what would be different if that room was full of people who had taught successfully in a low-income community? Because, you know, what Nicole and Aurora know, and what really our core members, as they, you know, respond on our surveys, tell us they know, is that we don't have low educational outcomes in low-income communities because kids are not motivated, or because parents don't care, or because there's not a culture of achievement. We have that problem because we're not giving kids the opportunities they deserve. And so while the general public, you know, right now, the ideology of our country, the priorities, everything that we're basing our policies and practices on is really, I would say, built on an assumption on the part of well-intentioned people that, as this, you know, the Gallup poll says, you know, that the public believes that we have an achievement gap because of, you know, out of 20 factors, the top 2 are lack of student motivation and lack of parental involvement. And you ask our core members the same question at the end of their 2 years, same options, and they say teacher quality and school leadership. So what they're fundamentally saying is it is within our control to do something about this. And seeing how the world works, and understanding that the Newsweek guy is going to have a cover story influenced by the people who were in that room, who are not always going to be educators, also fuels our sense of urgency to say we ultimately need the people who have influence in every sector to actually deeply understand this issue. And so all of this together just fuels us at Teach for America to say we have to do more, and it's what's leading us for ourselves, just as those teachers set big goals for themselves, to set big goals. You know, can we make Teach for America the top employer of top recent college grads by 5 years from now? You know, can we get to the point where on average our core members are moving their kids 1.5 years of student progress in a year's time? Can we get to the point where we have 100 elected officials among our alums and 600 school leaders, et cetera? So I think, so that's kind of, and you know, it's why probably, as exhausting as the first year of Teach for America was, you know, there's never been a less exhausting year, because initially there were the challenges of stabilizing this, and now there are the actually much more invigorating challenges of asking the question, you know, how do we build a truly effective movement to eliminate educational inequality in this country? And just based on everything I've seen, it's absolutely possible. And the only question is whether enough true leaders in your generation actually will step up and say, you know, we're going to lead us to that point. So I will close there, and you know, I'd love to engage in a discussion around any of this. I fear that I may have veered from the topic of leadership, but hopefully it gets at some of the issues, and I'd love to talk about anything you all would like to talk about. Any questions? Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, no, actually, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, in a community that calls itself the Bubble, for its complete lack of any sort of diversity and disadvantage, and arrived to Princeton somehow completely unaware of the disparities that exist in our country. And it was actually at Princeton of all places, and no doubt you all have seen, you know, similar things here, but that I realized that where people were born had so much to do with their educational prospects. And just through, you know, my freshman year roommate had gone to public school in the Bronx and was absolutely brilliant, and yet really struggled to meet the academic demands of Princeton, and we were rooming next to a very frustrating group of women who had gone to the prep schools on the East Coast and were calling Princeton a cakewalk. And that was literally my first experience that led me to realize that there were those disparities. And it was more, you know, I was a public policy major, was doing what concerned college students do at that time, at least if you go to Princeton, where, you know, you're not right in the middle of an urban area, you know, to just learn more about the issues. And I organized a conference on it my senior year, so I was thinking a lot about the issue, but really had not had personal experience in it. Yeah. So the question is, what do I think, you know, about teacher unions, and I'm realizing I should repeat the question, in terms of whether, you know, it seems like every time people, as you say, propose things that could impact teacher quality, like differentiated pay, that the unions get in the way. That's such a good question, because I think, first of all, I think that there's so much that can be done before we bang our head up against that wall. And I think that there are a lot of people out there right now who sort of think, well, the unions are constraining the whole thing and there's nothing that can be done. And what we see is that there is so very much that can be done. And, you know, I mean, I look at the incredible progress, really, that's been made even in the last 5 and 10 years in this. And, you know, that even without getting at the union issue. I do ultimately think that, and there's a growing group of folks out there who are kind of really raising awareness of what even just looking at studying union contracts tells you about what the constraints to progress are. And I do think that ultimately we're going to have to come to some great bargain, you know, all coming together at the table and saying we will never truly meet the needs of kids unless we rethink a lot of things, including, you know, those union contracts. It's a huge issue. There are various initiatives out there that I think have promise in terms of helping create a different environment, and an environment that's more conducive to actually tackling those issues. I don't know if that gets at your question. Sorry. Yes. She was asking about the role of feedback, you know, in our organization and how we approach that. And I really believe that our openness to feedback and the fact that we're constantly looking for feedback and really evolving every year, we evolve essentially everything that we do, other than our core mission, is really why, you know, we're thriving certainly at a much higher level now than we were 5 years ago or 5 years before that. I think one of the enablers to that mindset is that we have an organization that's very clear about its goals. So our whole organization, and we have 400 staff members right now, is very, very clear about exactly what we're trying to get done by the end of the year. We're trying to grow the number of people out there actually teaching by a certain, you know, number. We're trying to increase the percentage of our core members who affect significant academic gains by a certain number. We're trying to do more to ensure that our alums out there actually assume real leadership roles in the broader education reform effort, and we have certain real measures around that. And so it creates an environment where feedback is such a good thing. Like, people are dying for feedback because all that really matters, it's not a commentary on have they been effective in the past, it's just an enabler to get to their goals. I mean, to the point where we used to have this big value around constant learning. We were trying to build an environment where people were looking for data and wanted help to get where they were trying to go. And the interesting thing is we've done away with that whole thing because we realized that we've built such a culture of, as we say, relentless pursuit of results, that that's just a natural byproduct. Yeah.
Yeah, so we talk about in the class about cultivating leadership, developing leadership. But the question that I think is on many people's mind is, A, what do you look for when you recruit, and B, what do you think you can actually cultivate?
And those are pretty much the fundamental questions that we grapple with constantly and try to refine our answers to constantly. And so one thing we've done is actually look at the personal characteristics that differentiate the people who attain the level of success of the Auroras and Nicoles of the world. And we can sort of group our core members. I mean, there are some who affect significant academic gains according to a certain measure, some who are moving their kids forward a year's worth of progress in a year's time, solid academic gains, and some who are really struggling. And what we'll do is form different hypotheses about what might be differentiating people based on our experiences working with them out in the field, and then we'll test them. And those studies have really created Teach for America's selection model. The characteristics that have come through on those there are about 5 things. Still the biggest differentiator is actually past demonstrated achievement. So, you know, people who demonstrate a pattern of excellence across many pursuits, so academics, work experience, extracurriculars, who are the kind of people who are setting big goals for themselves and meeting them despite obstacles. That's still the best way to just know, is this person going to be able to succeed in this? But there are a set of other personal characteristics. So one way to get into Teach for America is just be a super duper spike all across the board. But what we found is you don't have to be. You know, you could be solid and have a set of these other characteristics and be really likely to succeed. And they are perseverance in the face of challenges, or what there's a term, I think, in the world somewhere that we've adopted called internal locus of control. And I don't know if you've studied things like this, but you know, it's sort of in the context of a challenge. You really can't see it outside of the context of a challenge, but in the context of a challenge, it's the instinct to figure out what you can control and own it and persevere. So taking the Nicole or the Aurora story as an example, week 3, your kids are at the first grade level. You've got an option, and some of our core members take one option and some take another. One option is blame everyone. It's the kids, it's the parents, it's the system. It's very easy to do that. And others will say, I got to solve this problem. And it's very hard to see that in people just graduating from college, because it's hard to, many people haven't really encountered serious challenges, so it's hard to see it. And that's our biggest challenge, is how do we develop a selection system that really does test in the right way for that. The ability to influence and motivate others in a sophisticated way, not charisma, but the instinct to appeal, to understand where someone's coming from and to appeal to their values. Problem-solving ability, organizational ability, and a set of characteristics that we call fit with Teach for America, meaning, you know, the desire to work relentlessly towards this particular mission, high expectations for kids and families in low-income communities. So we do look for that, and our real belief is that this is not a path meant for everyone, that even people who we interview who we think would probably be great teachers in many contexts, who, if we were even a principal in an urban area, might say, I want to hire this person, might not be exactly cut out for Teach for America, given what we're trying to do, which is we're asking people to really go in to environments that can be dysfunctional, not always, but can be and generally may be, and build almost an island of excellence within that. So we look for a certain bar at the front end, but then we also assume that we can do so much to speed up people's learning curve and to help people internalize basically this teaching as leadership approach and the basic teaching skills to teach that way. You know, how do you actually do it? How do you build a culture of achievement in your room that leads your kids to want to work harder than they've ever worked before? How do you plan instruction and teach in a very goal-oriented way? So, and then we believe a lot has to be done once someone starts teaching, and we can see it in our data. You know, so we take people who all meet the same selection criteria, all go through the same training, and then when they start teaching, we can see even differences between our sites, just significant differences in the percentage of our core members who are really successful with their kids. And that's led us to understand that the culture that our regional programs are building and the interventions that they have with their core members are hugely important. And so we do a lot to have, we have kind of formal observations and reflection cycles with each core member to really help people step back, reflect on where their kids are versus where they want them to be, understand the root causes of what they might be doing to bring about those outcomes, and kind of re-gear, just using that teaching as leadership framework as a mechanism. I mean, that's a little bit about what we're trying to do. There's a higher level. I mean, we've spent so much time over the last 5 years just trying to deeply, deeply understand what are the most successful teachers in our environment doing. And now what we're trying to do is build from that knowledge base and ask ourselves, how do we become great trainers and developers of people? Because our analysis is that about 1/3 of our people come in, they read the stuff where we've written down, here's what teaching as leadership is, and they go in the classroom and they do it. And that's more than, 5 years ago, before they were reading it, 10% were figuring it out on their own by the end of 2 years. But the question is, we really believe the other, 70% or 65% can get there, and that it's just about us training them better and developing them better. So, any other questions? Yeah. How long does what? Commit, as you know, 2 years. And then, our whole, as you heard before, deeply held concept here is that as long as they're asking themselves the question, how can I personally have the greatest possible impact on this problem, that their answers are great. Because we think we need many people to decide to stay in education, and we think we need many people who actually go into policy or into journalism or into business who understand what they understand if we're truly going to have a context that fosters reform. That being said, most of them stay. I hesitate to say that because, we're fighting the images of teaching and education and all, but of our alums, 63% of them are working full-time in education. And we've got 10,000 alums, some of whom started 14 years ago. As of their third year, 60% of them are still teaching. But of the 63%, some of them are teaching, and some of them are running schools in district leadership positions, et cetera. Great, thank you. Thanks.